My name is Zora Montgomery. I'm 31 years old, and on the night of my sister's wedding, I made one phone call that ended it, right in the middle of her first dance, in front of everyone she loved. I'd been planning that call for 47 days, not out of anger, out of arithmetic. In my ear, a stranger's voice was about to read me a number so large it would stop the music, stop the dancing, and finally answer a question I'd been asking my family my whole life. If I ever stopped being useful, would anyone still love me? I got my answer that night. But before I show you what it was, like this video and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what happens next took me 19 years to work up the nerve for. Now let me take you back to where it started. The ballroom smelled like white peonies and champagne. Golden light poured down from 3 crystal chandeliers, catching on 200 wine glasses and 180 guests in sequins and tuxedos. Rain tapped soft against the tall windows overlooking the Chicago River, the kind of steady October rain Midwesterners don't even look up for anymore. I stood near the edge of the dance floor in a navy blazer, a flute of champagne warming untouched in my hand. My phone was tucked against my ear, my thumb pressed hard against the microphone to keep the noise down. Across the room, my sister Serenity spun slowly in her new husband's arms, sequins catching the light like scattered stars, her smile wide and easy and untroubled. My father, Xavier, stood by the cake table, recording the whole thing on his phone. My mother, Amara, dabbed at her eyes with a cocktail napkin, pearls resting against her collarbone, crying the good kind of tears. And in my ear, a calm, professional voice from Centurion Services said the words that would end the party. Miss Montgomery, we're seeing unusual activity on your account, $127,480 in charges over the past 72 hours. Can you confirm these transactions? No, I said quietly. Lock the card. Call back in exactly 30 seconds. Put it on speaker when you do. The woman on the line didn't ask why. She just said, "Understood," and the call went dead. 30 seconds is a strange unit of time when you're the only person in a room who knows what's about to happen. The band kept playing, the guests kept swaying, and I counted. At 30, Serenity's clutch, a small white satin thing tucked under her arm even during the first dance, because some habits don't take a night off, began to buzz. She pulled back from Khalil just enough to glance down, still smiling, and answered without looking. "Hello?" Her voice was bright, breathless from spinning. I watched the color drain out of her cheeks the way water drains out of a tub. Not all at once, but in a way you can't stop once it starts. "What?" she said, too loud. "Bank! My sister's card!" The sentence just stopped. It hung there, unfinished, the way a held note hangs before it breaks. 180 guests. Absolute silence, except for rain against glass. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't triumph, and it wasn't rage. Underneath the stillness was 19 years of a very specific fear. The fear that if I ever stopped being useful, I would stop being loved at all. Locking that card wasn't cruelty. It was the first time I chose my own dignity over the family's comfort, and some small, terrified part of me still expected to be punished for it. I set my champagne down on a passing waiter's tray and walked toward the center of the floor. To understand why I did that, why I let my baby sister's first dance become the moment her entire world came undone, you have to understand what it means to be the reliable one in a family that only remembers you when something's due. I was the daughter who never broke curfew, never broke a promise, and, it turned out, never broke even when I probably should have. And in every drama family, there's always one person expected to hold the whole thing together without ever being thanked for it. I have a memory. I was 12, up to my elbows in dishwater at our kitchen sink, watching through the window as my father carried Serenity in from the yard on his shoulders because she'd scraped her knee doing a cartwheel. Nobody asked who'd make dinner. That was already understood. I have another. I'm 22, quietly signing over the balance of a merit scholarship into a family emergency fund. Because Serenity's tuition payment had bounced, and I was the one who always picked up. And I have one more. I'm 29, standing at an ATM at 2 in the morning, transferring $18,000 to pay off a credit card that wasn't mine because it had my name on it, and because somebody had to. Here's the part nobody in that ballroom knew yet. I hadn't found out about the wedding charges by accident. I've been watching them happen in real time for weeks. $18,500 for an Oscar de la Renta gown at Neiman Marcus, $9,200 for flowers, $42,000 for catering, $27,000 for a 12-piece band, $30,780 for a first-class honeymoon, $127,480 on my card, without my signature. I could have shut it down the first week. Instead, I let it run, right up until the exact moment my sister stood in the center of that ballroom, believing she had finally gotten away with something. Because there's a difference between stopping a person and letting a person finish exactly what they started, so everyone in the room can watch it collapse under its own weight. My father used to tell people I was the practical one. He meant it as a compliment, the way you compliment a mule for pulling a cart well. Well, tonight practical was about to look very different than anyone expected. I stopped 2 feet from where Serenity stood frozen. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and said, calm as still water, "That's the bank. I just locked the card." Somebody near the bar gasped. It carried. My father found his voice first. "Zora, what are you doing? You're going to ruin your sister's wedding." "I'm not ruining anything," I said. "I'm just done paying for it." Because I hadn't just decided to lock a card that night. I had decided 47 days earlier that I was done being anyone's safety net. If you've ever been the one everyone counted on and nobody thanked, stay with me. Because what happens in the next few minutes is what finally broke that pattern for good. Before I tell you what happened next in that ballroom, I need to take you back further. Because you can't understand a woman who planned something for 47 days without understanding what she spent 31 years learning first. I grew up in a 3-bedroom house on the south side of Chicago, the kind with a porch swing that had been creaking since around the Eisenhower administration. My father, Xavier, spent 30 years with United Airlines. My mother, Amara, taught 3rd grade at the elementary school 4 blocks over, the kind of teacher who genuinely loved other people's children, which made it stranger somehow how she loved her own. Our house wasn't just a home. It was a drama family in the making, long before anyone ever called it that out loud. I remember being 15, sitting on that same creaky porch swing, when Serenity, 13 at the time, backed my father's Honda straight into the mailbox, trying to prove she could drive it before she even had a permit. My father didn't yell. Within the month, he'd traded that Honda in for a newer one, cash down. I was working weekend shifts at the Jewel Osco on Michigan Avenue at the time, saving for a car of my own, dollar by dollar. I bought my first car used, with cash I'd earned myself, the same month Serenity got her second brand new one. Nobody in my family ever noticed that math. I noticed it for all of us. By 24, I'd been promoted to senior analyst at a firm just off the Magnificent Mile. That same week, Serenity dropped out of college with no real explanation. My mother called me crying that same night. Not about my promotion, about Serenity. "She's lost, Zora. Can you just help her get back on her feet, just for a little while?" I sent $4,200 the next morning. When I was 27, I got an offer to become director at a Black-founded investment fund in New York. Triple my salary, a corner office overlooking Central Park. That same week, my father had a minor stroke. Serenity was in Miami. My mother called me, voice shaking. "Zora, honey, you're the only one who can handle this. Not can you help, just you're the only one." I turned down the offer. 3 years later, I found out most of the money I'd been sending home during that stretch had instead paid for 2 trips to Las Vegas and a Hermes bag with a wait list longer than most people's mortgages. When I brought it up to my father, he patted my shoulder like I was a good dog who'd fetched the newspaper. "You're so practical, Zora. You never needed a big office anyway." Here's the part that finally cracked something open. 47 days before the wedding, my father went in for a routine cardiac follow-up. Nothing dramatic, just a checkup the family quietly agreed not to mention, because nothing was allowed to distract from wedding planning. I sat with him for 3 hours at Rush University Medical Center, and while I was there, I quietly covered a small unpaid balance on his account, $6,800, because the insurance paperwork had gotten tangled. That same visit, looking for my father's reading glasses in his jacket pocket, a folded piece of paper fell out, a printed text message. From Serenity, sent to my mother that same week. Mom, I'm gonna borrow Zora's card while she's in the shower or whatever, LOL. She never checks it close enough. Just let me handle the wedding stuff. She'll be quiet about it after. She always is. I sat there with the paper trembling slightly in my hand, and something in me went still. Because underneath Serenity's confidence was a much older fear, that she'd only ever been chosen when she was the star of something, and if she wasn't the center of this wedding, she might not be the center of anything. She wasn't stealing out of malice. She was protecting the one identity she'd ever been given, the girl everyone forgives. That's what made it so hard to hate her, and so impossible to keep excusing her. I downloaded the Centurion banking app that same night and turned on real-time alerts. I called Simone Parks the next morning, the sharpest attorney I know in the loop, whose practice covers financial fraud and real estate law, and my closest friend since our unpaid internship days. She played me an audio clip, a recording from a cousin's wedding 3 years earlier. My mother's voice, warm and certain. Zora will always handle it. She's the practical one. She never says no. Let Serenity have her moment. My father, laughing. That black card of hers is basically the family card at this point. Simone looked at me over her glasses. They've been counting on you for a long time, Zora. Now it's time you count on yourself. That was the moment I decided. Let it run. Every charge, all the way to the wedding, and then, at the exact moment everyone believed they'd gotten away clean, lock it publicly, and let the truth do the rest of the work. Every time my mother called asking me to just send 5,000 more, sweetheart, I said the same 2 words, okay, Mom. I sat in my loft in Bronzeville most evenings during that stretch, looking out over the skyline, and I said something out loud to nobody but myself. Not this time. This time, I'm not the ATM. Because 47 days is exactly how long it takes for a plan like that to become undeniable. And what happened next, in front of 180 guests, is only where it started to unravel. A mother who knew about this plan 2 weeks in advance and said nothing, is that just as guilty as the daughter who carried it out? Comment 1 if you say the mother is worse. Comment 2 if you say the sister is worse. I want to see which side wins before we move on. The Langham, Chicago. 180 guests, though it felt smaller now. Everyone pulled in tight around the same silence. The first dance had stopped mid-chorus. The band saxophonist still had his instrument raised halfway to his mouth, like his body hadn't caught up to what his ears had just heard. Above the dance floor, the 3 crystal chandeliers kept turning their slow, indifferent light across 200 wine glasses, as if nothing in the room had changed at all. Somewhere near the entrance, the wedding photographer lowered her camera an inch, then raised it again, unsure whether this, too, was a moment worth capturing. My voice, through the venue's own microphone system, carried clean across the ballroom. This is a courtesy call from Centurion Services, the automated voicemail replay clicked in through the speakers. The Amex Centurion card ending in 7291, belonging to Zora Montgomery, has been locked due to unauthorized charges totaling $127,480. A chargeback has been initiated. Affected vendors will be notified within 15 minutes. Phones started buzzing, one after another, a soft electric static rippling table to table. The caterer's assistant answered his and went still, his jaw tightening before he even spoke. Ma'am, cards declined. We need payment now or we pull service. Serenity's voice cracked across the silence. Zora, I was just borrowing it. I told you I'd pay you back. You never told me anything, I said even, carrying without needing to rise. You told Mom you'd borrow it while I was in the shower. That's not the same as asking. Her mouth opened again, but nothing came out this time. Somewhere behind her, one of the bridesmaids quietly stepped back half a foot, the way people do when they realize they're standing too close to something about to fall. My father shoved forward through stunned guests, his face gone dark red, a vein I recognized from every argument of my childhood standing out along his temple. Have you lost your mind? You're humiliating this family in front of everyone we know. There it was, the same sentence, almost word for word, he'd used when I was 17 and told him I didn't want to keep tutoring Serenity's classmates for free just because he'd volunteered me without asking. You're embarrassing this family. Never, you're hurting yourself. Always the family, first, like I existed as one of its rooms rather than a person who lived inside it. I'm not ruining anything, I said. I'm just done paying for it. Because I hadn't just decided to lock a card that night. I had decided 47 days earlier that I was done being anyone's safety net. My mother's phone lit up on the sweetheart table, screen glowing a pale, accusing blue against the white tablecloth. A message preview flashed bright across the lock screen, visible to anyone standing close. From Serenity, sent 2 minutes ago. Mom, if Zora makes a scene, just say you and Dad told me to use the card. She'll stay quiet. She always does. I watched my mother's face go the color of the tablecloth, but it was something else that caught my attention for just a half second longer than it should have. The way her hand didn't reach for the phone right away. The way she glanced instead, almost involuntarily, toward my father's jacket pocket, like there was a second phone in this story she was more worried about than the one glowing on the table. I filed it away without understanding it. I wouldn't understand it for months, not until a flash drive taught me what that glance had actually meant. So this was already agreed on, I said softly. Everyone had their lines ready. Khalil's hand slipped off Serenity's waist. He stepped back half a foot, his jaw working, his eyes moving from her face to my father's to my mother's, like a man doing math he didn't want to finish. For one strange moment, nobody moved at all. The rain kept tapping the windows. Somewhere outside, a boat horn sounded low and far off on the river, muffled through the glass. It was such an ordinary sound, the kind of thing this city made 1,000 times a night without meaning anything by it. And yet it landed in that silence like punctuation. Like the room itself was marking the end of a sentence 19 years in the making. I pulled out my phone and turned the screen toward my father, a video clip from 47 days ago that Simone had pulled from Serenity's own story archive before it expired. I hadn't watched it since the night Simone sent it to me. My thumb hovered over the play button for 1 extra second, and in that second I felt something close to grief. Not for what Serenity had done, but for the version of her I'd apparently spent 31 years inventing. One who wouldn't have said what I was about to let this room hear. Then I pressed play. Serenity's voice, laughing, tipsy, filled the small speaker. Zora's so clueless, honestly. That black card is basically mine at this point. Mom and Dad will tell her to just deal with it, like they always do. The silence that followed was heavier, final. Even the saxophonist finally lowered his instrument all the way. Khalil let go of Serenity's hand entirely. You told me your parents were covering everything, he said, low, almost to himself, more to the floor than to her. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out a red envelope. Printed statements, chargeback confirmations, dates and dollar amounts in neat columns, and held it out to my sister. My hand didn't shake handing it over, though I noticed, distantly, that it wanted to. She grabbed it and tore it down the middle without opening it, the sound of paper ripping unnaturally loud in a room that had gone otherwise silent. You did this on purpose, she said, voice shaking. You let it all happen just to embarrass me. No, I said. I let it happen so you'd finally understand what it feels like when nobody's covering for you. Over the next 20 minutes, it moved fast, the way collapses always do once the first support beam gives way. The caterer's team quietly packed chafing dishes back onto rolling carts, the metal lids clattering softly against each other. The band started zipping instrument cases, the zippers loud in a room that had lost its music. Guests began drifting toward the coat check, phones already lifted, a few recording, most just texting someone who wasn't there to see it for themselves. My mother rushed toward me, pearls swinging, mascara streaked down both cheeks. "Zora, please," she begged, right there in front of everyone left standing. "We'll sell the Southside house if we have to. Just turn the card back on. Please, baby, please." I looked at her for a long moment. Behind her fear wasn't just love for Serenity. It was my mother's own terror of losing control of a story she'd spent 30 years narrating to herself. The one where she'd raised 2 happy daughters and made no mistakes. Begging me in public wasn't really about the money. It was about needing me to stay quiet again so that story could survive one more night. And for the first time, I understood that giving in wouldn't have been kindness. It would have been agreeing to keep lying with her. "No," I said quietly. "Not this time." Khalil turned to face the room. "I'm not marrying someone who lied to me," he said, loud enough that the last stragglers near the doors stopped to listen. "The wedding's off." Serenity's knees gave out beneath the weight of her own dress. She sank down onto the parquet floor, white sequins pooling around her like spilled milk, one shoe slipping off as she folded, her bouquet still loosely clenched in one fist, as though some part of her hadn't caught up to the fact that there was nothing left to hold it for. She looked up at me. "You're destroying me," she whispered. I crouched down slightly, close enough to smell her perfume, the same one she'd worn since she was 19, the same one that used to make me feel, once, like the little sister I was watching over, rather than the older one holding her up. "No," I said gently, without a trace of cruelty in my voice, only exhaustion. "I'm just removing the spine I've been lending you your whole life. What's left is yours to stand on." I stood up, straightened my blazer, and turned to walk away. For just a second before I moved, I let myself breathe. One long breath in, one long breath out. The first full breath I remembered taking all night. 19 years of arithmetic had just come due in a single room, and my body hadn't fully registered yet that the debt was finally paid. That's when Khalil, still holding his phone, said something that changed the shape of the night one more time. "Wait," he said, voice tight. "There's something else you all need to see." By morning, this story had already started moving through group chats across Chicago's Black professional circles faster than any of us were ready for. But there was still one more piece of paper left to fall, and it was about to prove this hadn't just been Serenity's plan all along. 20 minutes after the bank call, the ballroom had thinned to maybe 40 people. The caterers were gone, the ice sculpture had started collapsing into itself on its silver tray, one swan wing already dissolved into a thin silver puddle. Somewhere near the stage, a stray microphone stand had been left standing, feeding a low electrical hum into the room, and nobody had bothered to switch it off, as if the whole space were still waiting to see what would happen next before it allowed itself to go quiet. Rain still tapped steady against the tall windows facing the river. My father stood near the cake table with his tie loosened and his jacket half slipped off one shoulder, like a man who'd started to leave twice and stopped himself both times. My mother hadn't moved. One hand stayed pressed flat against her sternum, pearl slightly crooked now, catching the low chandelier light in a way that looked less elegant than it had an hour earlier, brittle instead of bright. Khalil stepped forward with a folded document he'd apparently been carrying since he checked into the honeymoon suite that morning. "I need everyone to see this," he said, his voice carrying an edge I hadn't heard from him before. Not anger exactly, but the flatness of a man realizing he'd been managed the entire time he thought he was in control. He unfolded the paper. It crackled once, sharp, in a room gone quiet enough that the sound carried to the back wall. "This is the booking confirmation for our honeymoon suite. $30,000. It's not Serenity's signature on the guarantee line." He turned it toward my mother. "It's yours, Mrs. Montgomery. You put down Zora's card as the guarantee a month ago. You knew this whole thing was riding on a card that wasn't yours." My mother's hand tightened around her pearls until her knuckles went pale. Her face, though, stayed composed. The same trained stillness she'd used for 30 years of parent-teacher conferences. The same stillness I'd understand many weeks later, she must have worn every time she moved money into an account I didn't know existed. I didn't know that yet. In that moment, I only knew her silence had a weight to it I couldn't quite name, and some old instinct in me, the instinct that had spent 19 years explaining away every uncomfortable thing my mother did, tried to reach for an excuse on her behalf. I let it pass through me without picking it up. So it wasn't just her, I said. It was all of you. Everyone signed on to this. I stood straight and adjusted the lapel of my blazer. A small, steadying gesture, something to do with my hands so they wouldn't shake in front of 40 people. From the time I was 15 until right now, I have paid $214,000 into this family, I said. My voice didn't shake, though I felt it trying to, somewhere underneath. Tuition, hospital bills, debts nobody wanted to explain to me, a wedding I was never even asked to help plan, only to fund. I'm not asking for that money back. I'm asking for something else. I'm asking to stop being treated like a machine that cries and still writes the check anyway. Today, I locked the card, I said. Tomorrow, I'm walking out that door and not looking back. I'm not angry anymore. I'm just tired. And I'm finally tired enough to leave. I turned toward the exit. Behind me, Serenity's voice broke apart entirely. Gee, you're destroying me. How could you let this happen in front of everyone? I turned halfway. I didn't destroy you, I said. I just stopped holding you up. What happens next is yours. I kept walking, past the coat check, past a bridesmaid crying quietly into her phone, past a stack of gift boxes nobody would ever open together as a married couple. Nobody followed me out that night. I stood under the awning outside the Lingham for a long moment, rain misting sideways off Wacker Drive, catching the amber streetlight in thin diagonal lines before it hit the pavement. The Chicago River moved dark and steady just beyond the railing, indifferent to everything that had just happened 40 feet above it. I thought, absurdly, of the porch swing back on the south side, the one that had been creaking since the Eisenhower administration, and of a 15-year-old girl who used to sit on it doing math nobody else in her family seemed to be doing. I didn't feel triumphant standing there in the rain. I felt something closer to the quiet after a fever breaks, hollowed out but finally cool. I called a car and went home. By sunrise, word had already spread through half of Chicago's Black professional community. My phone had over 60 notifications by 7 a.m. Cousins, sorority sisters, an aunt I hadn't spoken to since a funeral 3 years back, all wanting details, all careful not to ask outright whose side they should be on. I didn't answer most of them. I made coffee instead, standing at my kitchen window in Bronzeville while the sky over the skyline turned from gray to a pale, washed-out gold, and let the messages pile up, unread. Serenity was, in the blunt language of the internet, canceled. Dropped from 2 bridal party group chats within days. My parents fared worse in some ways because they'd co-signed the honeymoon guarantee using my card without my knowledge. Once the chargebacks cleared, the bank came looking for someone to make good on the unpaid balances. That someone turned out to be my parents' own accounts. I sat in my loft that Saturday morning, coffee going cold beside me, sunlight cutting a long, pale rectangle across the hardwood floor, when Simone called. I could hear traffic behind her voice, the particular hollow echo of someone standing outside a downtown building. Chargeback went through in full, she said. All $127,480. It'll hit your account within 5 business days. I didn't feel triumphant hearing that either. Mostly, I felt the particular quiet that comes after a long fever finally breaks. The kind where your body doesn't know yet whether to rest or brace for the next one. Later that afternoon, I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time before opening the Cash App. I thought about a 5-year-old with scraped knees being carried on our father's shoulders, and a woman in a wedding dress sinking to a ballroom floor, and how both of those people were somehow the same person, and how I still hadn't figured out how to stop loving her, even after everything. I sent Serenity $1,000. In the memo line, taxi money, rest, you figure out. I stood at my window that evening, the Willis Tower catching the last orange light of the afternoon, and I thought about something Simone had mentioned weeks earlier, a flash drive of old records she'd started quietly keeping, just in case. There was one more piece of this story still waiting to surface, and it wasn't going to come from my parents or from Simone's files. It was going to come from Serenity herself, in a quiet moment months later, in a place none of us expected. What Serenity leaves behind for me a few months from now is the part of this story that still catches in my throat. Stay with me for that. 6 weeks passed. Chicago moved through its slow slide from October into November, the kind of stretch where the wind off Lake Michigan starts reminding you winter isn't a rumor anymore. I spent Saturday mornings that November in Grant Park with an intelligentsia coffee, watching runners loop the paths near Buckingham Fountain, my breath fogging faintly in the cold. I'd started doing something I hadn't done since college, sitting still, on purpose, with nowhere I had to be and no one waiting on a transfer. The first few Saturdays, it felt like withdrawal, some part of me listening for a phone call I needed to answer. By the fourth Saturday, it started to feel like something closer to peace. Simone met me there one gray morning, 2 coffees in hand, her coat collar turned up against the wind.
"You look lighter," she said, handing me mine.
"I feel lighter," I said. "Is that allowed?" "It's overdue," she said, and didn't push further, which was its own kind of kindness. We talked mostly about her caseload, about a Bulls game she'd been to, about nothing that mattered. And I understood, sitting there, that this was what a friendship without a bill attached actually felt like. My mother still called. I let most go to voicemail. One Tuesday, I picked up out of some old reflex I hadn't fully let go of yet. "Zora," she said, her voice smaller than I remembered it, thinner around the edges. "Serenity's working part-time now, at Khalil's mother's hair salon, if you can believe it. She's gotten thin, Zora. I worry." There was something underneath the words I couldn't place yet, a careful, evasive quality, the sound of a woman choosing which sentences to leave out. I didn't chase it. I told her I hoped Serenity was doing all right and found a reason to end the call. A few weeks later, on a gray Thursday, I walked past the Langham Chicago on my way to a meeting near the river. Through the front windows, fluorescent light washed flat and white across the lobby, nothing like the gold chandelier glow of the wedding 6 weeks earlier. A woman in a plain black uniform pushed a housekeeping cart down the hallway, one wheel squeaking faintly with every rotation, a stack of folded white towels leaning against a bottle of glass cleaner. It took me a second longer than it should have to recognize her. Serenity had cut her hair short, just her natural curls cropped close to her scalp. Gone was the Oscar de la Renta gown, the sequins catching chandelier light like scattered stars. She looked up and saw me through the glass, and neither of us moved. For a moment, I was looking at both versions of her at once. The bride spinning in the center of a room built entirely around her, and this woman, quiet, unadorned, pushing a cart down a hallway that used to belong to someone else's celebration. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just gave me one small nod, the kind you give a stranger you recognize but don't quite know how to greet. I nodded back. Neither of us needed an apology in that moment. We just needed to be seen, plainly, for the first time in longer than either of us could count. A block later, my phone buzzed, the hotel's front desk forwarding a note she'd left for me. Inside a small envelope waiting at my office that afternoon was an old photograph, the 2 of us, ages 8 and 5, sitting together on a patch of grass on the south side, my arms wrapped around her, both of us missing at least one front tooth, laughing at something neither of us would remember by the time we grew up. I remembered that day, faintly, a sprinkler running somewhere off frame, my mother calling us in for dinner, Serenity refusing to let go of my hand even after we'd stood up. On the back of the photo, "You'd been planning this for a long time, hadn't you? I understand now. I'm sorry I let you be alone in it for so long." Tucked behind the photo was a small flash drive. I plugged it in that night, sitting cross-legged on my living room floor with the lamp turned low, and what I found took the breath clean out of my chest. Bank statements going back nearly 5 years. Small recurring transfers I'd never authorized, routed into an account under my parents' names that I hadn't known existed. $89,000 total. Money on top of everything I'd already knowingly given, moved slowly enough in amounts small enough that I'd never noticed the pattern. 200 here, 400 there. A silent, patient siphon running under a life I'd thought I understood completely. I didn't cry. I sat very still instead, the laptop's glow the only light in the room, and let out one long breath. The kind that comes from somewhere deeper than your lungs. The sound of finally understanding the actual shape of something you'd only ever seen the edges of before.
The next morning, I signed 3 new consulting contracts with early-stage founders in Hyde Park.
For the first time in 31 years, I wasn't anybody's oldest daughter. Quiet backstop for everyone else's mistakes. I was just Zora. That weekend, I bought a piece of acrylic art from a local Black artist in Bronzeville. A woman standing alone under warm Chicago sunlight, her shoulders straight, nobody's weight resting on them but her own. I hung it across from my window, so it would be the first thing I saw every morning. I called Simone the following Monday. I want to know exactly what our options are with that flash drive, I told her. Not to punish anyone, just so I finally know the whole shape of what happened.
There's one more thing, Simone said, and I could hear paper shuffling on her end. The particular pause of someone about to deliver news they'd rather not. The South Side house. Your parents have fallen behind. It's headed toward foreclosure. I sat with that for a long moment, looking at the woman in the painting across the room. My parents had put decades into that house. It was nearly paid off before the last few rough years wore the balance back up. I realized then that every drama family eventually needs someone to break the pattern, even quietly, even alone. Find out what it would take to buy the note, I said, quietly, through the bank, not through them. I didn't know yet that within the year, that decision would bring my parents to my own doorstep, and that what I chose to do next would look nothing like what anyone, including me, expected. A year passed.
I want to tell you that a year is a long time, and it is. But it's also strange how fast it moves once you stop spending it holding other people up. My consulting work grew steadily that year. 3 founders became 11, then a small team of my own working out of a shared office in Hyde Park. I started seeing a therapist on Wednesday evenings, mostly to sit with the fact that peace, when it finally arrives, doesn't always feel like relief at first. Sometimes it feels like grief wearing a different coat. I kept the appointment anyway, every week, because I decided that taking care of myself deserved the same discipline I'd once given to everyone else's emergencies.
Over that year, Simone's office worked quietly through the bank's loss mitigation channel, negotiating to purchase the remaining balance on my parents' mortgage note directly, using the recovered chargeback funds along with savings I'd built consulting for the Hyde Park startups. By late summer, the note belonged to a small private fund I'd set up and quietly named the Quiet Backbone Foundation. I stood on the rooftop of my building in Bronzeville one September evening, watching the sun drop behind the Willis Tower, the sky bruising slowly from orange to violet, the city's noise softened by the height and the distance. It was the kind of evening I used to spend on the phone solving somebody else's crisis. That night, I just watched the sky change. My doorbell rang a little after 8. I remember the sound of it clearly.
2 short chimes, then a pause, then a third, as if whoever was ringing it wasn't sure the first 2 had registered. When I opened it, my father was standing there holding a thin legal envelope with both hands like it might slip if he loosened his grip. His hands were shaking slightly, just at the fingertips. My mother stood just behind him, pearls absent for once, her eyes already red, a folded tissue balled up in one fist. "The house is going into foreclosure," my father said, his voice cracking in a way I'd never once heard from him in 31 years. "The bank's taking it. We need you, Zora. You're the oldest. You're the one who always—" "Please," my mother interrupted, tears falling freely now, catching the porch light. "Without you, this family falls apart completely."
I looked at the 2 of them for a long moment, the September air cool against my bare arms, a moth circling the porch light above their heads.
What I saw wasn't cruelty anymore. It was fear, plain and unguarded, from 2 people who had built their whole sense of security on the assumption that I would always be there to absorb the cost. Some part of me still wanted to fix it for them, the way I always had. I felt that old reflex rise in my chest like muscle memory. But I finally understood that rescuing them again wouldn't be love. It would just be teaching them, one more time, that nothing they did would ever really cost them anything. I stepped back and turned my laptop screen toward the doorway. "This is the transfer paperwork," I said, steady, without malice, without triumph, just fact laid plainly on the table. "A few months ago, I worked with the bank to purchase the remaining balance on this mortgage through a private fund. It's called the Quiet Backbone Foundation. I set it up myself. As of today, the foundation holds the note. I'm not calling in the $214,000 I've put into this family over the years. I'm not evicting you tonight either, but you'll need to start making arrangements because I won't be the one covering the payments going forward, and this house isn't going to keep running on my silence anymore." I let that settle in the doorway before I finished. I'm not asking for the money back. I'm just done being the emergency fund nobody thanks. My father's mouth opened, then closed again, like a man who'd rehearsed a dozen responses on the drive over and found none of them fit the moment he was actually standing in. My mother didn't say anything at all. I closed the door gently. I didn't watch through the peephole to see their faces. I didn't need to. I sat down on my couch afterward, the painting of the woman under Chicago sunlight watching me from across the room, and let myself feel both things at once, the relief of finally saying it, and the quiet grief of knowing some doors don't reopen the same way twice. 3 days later, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I hadn't heard from in months. "Sis, I don't know how to say this except to just say it. I'm pregnant. Khalil's gone. I'm scared and I'm not asking you for money. I just wanted you to know because you're still my sister, even after everything." I sat with that message for a long time before I answered, the apartment quiet around me, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. I thought about a 5-year-old on a patch of Southside grass, refusing to let go of my hand. "I'm glad you told me," I wrote back. "I'm not going back to how things were. But I'm not going anywhere either. If you ever need someone to sit with you at an appointment, or just need to hear a voice that isn't Mom's, call me. That offer doesn't expire." She wrote back, one word. "Okay." Then a minute later, "Thank you for still answering." That was enough. It didn't erase 19 years. It didn't need to. It was just two sisters finally being honest with each other for the first time without a wedding, a debt, or an audience standing between them. Maybe that's what every drama family teaches you in the end. That peace isn't something you're given. It's something you finally take for yourself. On the table behind me sat the painting I'd bought in Bronzeville, the woman standing alone under Chicago sunlight, unburdened, upright. I walked into my small kitchen that evening and made a pot of collard greens, the recipe my mother used to make on Sunday afternoons. The smell of smoked turkey and simmering greens filling the apartment the way it used to fill our old kitchen on the south side. Except this time, there was no one else's mess to clean up after. I sat down at my kitchen table, alone, and ate slowly, steam still rising off the bowl, the city lights just starting to come on outside my window. For the first time in my whole life, that particular bittersweet taste belonged to nobody but me. This story reminds us that love, which only shows up when you're useful, was never really love. It was an arrangement. And arrangements can be renegotiated at any age. If you're the one everyone in your family still calls first when there's a mess to clean up, here's something practical. Open a separate account this month that no one else can touch and let it sit untouched for 6 months before deciding what it's for. If a grown child or sibling asks to borrow money, ask them to put the request in writing first, even just a text, before you say yes. If they won't write it down, you already have your answer. Call one old friend you've been meaning to call. Not because you need anything, but because a friendship that asks nothing of you is worth keeping alive. And if your evenings have gotten quiet since you lost your husband or retired from a life that used to keep you busy, put your own name on something this season. A class at the community center, a garden plot, a Tuesday lunch group. Because dignity, at any age, starts with having something in your life that belongs only to you.